Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the case of Helen Naslund? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I will put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. First, I'll look at the background in this case, move to the timeline of the crime, then offer my analysis. Helen Naslund was born in 1964 and raised in the province of Alberta, Canada. She was the youngest of 8 children. In her younger years, she moved from one farm to another with her family. She left home at the age of 16 and moved to Camrose, which is about an hour and 10 minutes southeast of Edmonton. She found work in a cafeteria. In 1981, when she was 17, a 20-year-old man named Miles Naslund started following her around, insisting that they get to know each other. Helen started dating him. Not long after this, they moved into an apartment together. Helen wasn't really ready for this type of commitment. She tried to end the relationship, but Miles hit her with a guilt trip. He said nobody cared about him, and he had nowhere to go. Helen was frightened of Miles, but at the same time felt sorry for him. The couple stayed together. They married in 1983. At this time, she was 19 and he was 21. Just as when they were dating, Helen didn't feel as though Miles was a good match for her as a husband. However, they both wanted to buy land and a farm. She hoped that would be enough of a connection to keep their marriage strong. In 1985, they moved to a farm near the town of Holden, which is about 45 minutes northeast of Camrose. They had a son named Wesley the year before this. They would go on to have 2 more sons, Daryl in 1988 and Neil in 1992. In addition to staying busy working on the farm, Helen enjoyed racing her horses at local rodeos. On one occasion, Helen was at a rodeo with a friend longer than planned. When she arrived home, Miles erupted in anger. She was surprised at how powerful his rage was. Miles pressured her to get rid of the horses, which she did. Right away, she felt as though she backed the wrong horse. Helen considered leaving at that point, but she recently had a child, and she maintained a traditional view of marriage. She decided to stay and try to make it work. Life on the farm was difficult. Everybody worked hard, including Helen, but financially the farm wasn't working out. Over the years, Miles and Helen sold pieces of their land until eventually they did not have much left. Helen went to work at an equipment store in Camrose. Miles was becoming paranoid. He was unhappy that Helen worked outside of the farm. The longer Helen was at her job, the angrier he became. Miles would frequently call her on the phone when she was at work. When she arrived home, he would demand a detailed report of what she had done during her shift. Over time, Miles became more erratic, his drinking increased, and so did his level of violence. A few years earlier, Miles had sustained a head injury during a fight outside of a bar in Holden. Helen believed that this was making his anger worse. Miles would occasionally threaten his family with a revolver. At other times, he would simply play with the gun, like he would twirl it on his finger. Helen was concerned for her safety at all times. Now moving to the timeline of the crime. On September 3, 2011, 47-year-old Helen finished her shift at the equipment rental company. When she arrived home, she found that Miles was intoxicated. At this time, Neil and Daryl lived in the house. Helen's other son, Wes, had moved out. Using a firearm, Miles threatened both Helen and Neil, demanding that they complete the farm work for the day. Helen operated a tractor with a hay cutter that evening. She resumed this work on September 4, but the tractor broke down. Miles went into a rage and threw wrenches at her. He attempted to repair the tractor as Helen was preparing dinner. When Miles came back into the house, he told Helen that she would pay dearly for damaging the tractor. Helen served dinner to Miles, but he was not happy with it. He pushed the food, glasses, plates, and silverware onto the floor in a violent fashion. He proclaimed that the meal was not fit for a dog, which makes me wonder if Miles ever owned a dog. I think most dogs would have enthusiastically approved of that dinner. Sometime after the commission of his callous, colorful, and contemptuous canine cooking condemnation, Miles passed out. Cognizant that her culinary critic husband was catching some Z's, Helen retrieved a .22 caliber revolver during the early morning hours of September 5. She approached Miles as he was sleeping and shot him twice in the back of the head. Miles did not survive. Helen decided not to notify the authorities. She was afraid that nobody would believe that she had been mistreated by her husband. In the morning, Helen and Neil loaded the body into a metal truck toolbox. They drilled holes in the toolbox, weighed it down, and welded it shut. They dropped it into a small reservoir on the property. They disposed of the revolver in water near the house, rented a backhoe from the place where Helen worked, and buried a Chevrolet Cavalier owned by Miles, and set the mattress on fire. On September 6, 2011, Helen contacted the police and reported her husband missing. She suggested to the police that Miles may have brought an end to his own life. Helen knew that he had threatened to do this before, and people were aware of that. Therefore, the story was considered believable. A number of people in the community had a feeling that Helen had murdered Miles, but nobody really seemed to care. Miles was not well liked, and his history of mistreating Helen was not a secret. There were no organized efforts in the community to find him. No one really missed him. The police didn't really seem to care that much either. It took them 2 days to visit the area and take statements, and they did not make any effort to search the farm. It appeared as though everybody was ready to move on, whether homicide was involved or not. Helen continued to live her life. For example, she obtained 2 horses and started racing at rodeos again. She drank heavily during this time. On occasion, she would call the police and ask them why they had not found her husband yet. 6 years went by, and nothing happened with the case. In 2017, the police investigated stories about statements being made by Helen's son, Daryl. They heard that he told multiple people about how his father was killed. The police searched the farm and found the body of Helen's husband, his Chevrolet Cavalier, and the revolver. Helen was arrested and confessed to the murder. She was charged with first-degree murder. Neil was arrested and charged with first-degree murder as well. Wes was charged with accessory to murder after the fact. Daryl was not charged with anything. Helen was facing a minimum of 25 years in prison if she was convicted of first-degree murder. She was under a lot of pressure to accept a deal, which she did in October of 2020. She pleaded guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 18 years in prison. Neil was permitted to plead guilty to a charge called indecently offering an indignity to human remains. The murder charge was dismissed. He received only 3 years in prison. The charges against Wes were dropped. In January 2022, after receiving support from a number of people, Helen's sentence was reduced to 9 years on appeal. Now moving to my analysis. Helen's sentence reduction was a victory for her and her supporters, but many people were not happy. Some people believe that Helen should never have been charged with any crime. Others believe that first-degree murder was appropriate. The manslaughter plea deal was a gift, and that she accepted that gift after careful contemplation. This brings me to the question, was Helen guilty of a crime in this case? Let's take a look at the factors both for and against the idea that she was guilty, starting with the inculpatory evidence. Helen had a number of ways to escape her husband that did not involve killing him. Her non-shooting options were plentiful. There were good times in the marriage as well as bad times. Not all the time she spent with him was characterized by aggression and violence. On the night of the killing, Miles was asleep. Helen retrieved a pistol, pointed it at the back of her husband's head, and pulled the trigger twice. He was completely vulnerable in that moment and not a threat to her in any way. After killing him, Helen could have notified the police and hired an attorney. Instead, she embarked on an extensive journey of eradicating any evidence of the shooting and created a false narrative to explain her husband's disappearance. She even conspired with one of her sons in order to escape responsibility. Between the time of the killing and when she was arrested, Helen repeatedly complained to the police for not finding her husband. Before accepting a plea deal for manslaughter, Helen was evaluated by a mental health professional. She was found not to have battered woman syndrome. Helen was represented by competent attorneys who carefully negotiated a plea deal which acknowledged that Helen had been mistreated at the hands of Miles. Everybody involved weighed all the circumstances of the case and agreed that the plea deal was a suitable compromise. Moving to the exculpatory factors, Helen had endured physical, verbal, and emotional abuse at the hands of her husband Miles for almost 30 years. Miles had threatened her with a firearm. He choked her. He physically struck her. He forced her to work on the farm. He screamed at her. He made her get rid of her horses, insulted her cooking, and he was extremely controlling. Helen suggested that Miles was frequently with her. When she was alone, he would demand an exact accounting of who she talked to and where she was. Considering all the evidence, do I think that Helen was guilty? In my opinion, Helen was guilty of second-degree murder. She was not in danger when she pulled the trigger. There was no imminent threat. There is no question that she had other options. A mental health professional determined that she did not have battered woman syndrome, and Helen worked diligently to escape responsibility after the shooting, much more so than the average homicide. When Helen was sent to prison, she had no expectation that anyone was going to help her get released early. She accepted her fate. She was advised by competent attorneys when she accepted the plea deal. There was informed consent. I think there are cases where domestic violence can reduce the culpability in a homicide, but this case doesn't meet those criteria. There's some concern about what type of precedent this case sets, especially considering how Miles was defenseless when he was killed. What are people supposed to take away from this case? If a person is in a relationship characterized by domestic violence, does that create a permanent sentence differential for any killing that occurs? If Miles had killed Helen, he would have been convicted of first-degree murder. But because Helen endured mistreatment at his hands, she was convicted of manslaughter and ultimately only received 9 years. The result here is an awkward power dynamic. One party is mistreating the other, but the victim has the option of killing the offender at a reduced cost. Is that supposed to make the relationship balanced? When a killing occurs not in response to an imminent threat, this is the type of unusual situation that emerges. Is this sentencing differential permanent in the relationship, or can it be reset? Like if the couple goes to counseling, do the sentences for homicide return to equal? I can imagine a husband saying to his wife after a counseling session, "Okay, we are good now. No reduced sentence homicide for you." There is no doubt that Helen is a sympathetic character in some ways, but it's dangerous to set a precedent where an individual can shoot someone in the back of the head twice and only go to prison for 9 years. Miles may not have been a nice guy, but he never had a chance in court. He never had an opportunity to make his case. There is often more to the story. Now moving to my final thoughts. Helen is looking forward to owning horses again, but she still struggles with what happened. She does not sleep well because she is fearful that Miles might be waiting there in her dreams. Perhaps when Helen wakes up and remembers how she murdered her husband, welded his body into a metal box, and submerged it in a reservoir, she will feel more comfortable about his chances of coming back and harming her. Those are my thoughts in the case of Helen Naslund. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be informative. Thanks for watching.